شاید همه ما با فیلم هایی که از روی نوشته ایشون ساخته شده هیجان زده شدیم و الان برامون کلی هیجان انگیزه که اون نویسنده رو در کنار خودمون داریم. از طرف خودم و از طرف شما ازشون بسیار بسیار سپاسگزارم که دعوت ما رو قبول کردن و به دارالفنون اومدن. مطمئنم که در این 2 ساعت خیلی چیز ازشون یاد خواهیم گرفت. با افتخار میخوام دعوت کنم از آقای شریدر که با ما باشن.
I've taught screenwriting a number of times over the years. I've taught it at UCLA in Los Angeles, and I've taught it at Columbia University in New York. When I teach it, I teach my own method. I don't teach anybody else's. There are no textbooks. And this is a method that I devised for myself and works for me. It may not work for you. Most likely it won't. But it is instructive nonetheless, because by hearing one writer talk about an approach to storytelling and screenwriting, even if it's not the approach you would take, you're going to learn something. And so if you bear with me, we'll go through this particular approach. And so what I do in the first class is I tell everybody at the university who's interested to come. And usually it's a room about this size. And I have an introductory lecture, which is basically to the effect that art works. You know, art can be decorative, but it also can be functional. And it can be as functional as any other tool, be as functional as a hammer or a saw. And the kind of screenwriting I'm sort of interested in is functional. It's because that's how I ended up being a screenwriter. I was in Los Angeles. I was a film critic. I'd always meant to be a film critic. And I ran into a difficult period of depression, wandering, marriage broke up, lost my job. And I was just driving around Los Angeles and drinking. And at that time, there were these softcore porn theaters that were open all night long, and you could go there and sleep because I was living in my car. And there was also a gun in the car. And after a while of living like this, I got a pain in my stomach. And I went to the hospital. And it turned out that at the age of 26, I had a bleeding ulcer. And I was just driving around. And when I checked into the hospital, I realized I hadn't spoken to anyone for weeks. And when I was in there, this image occurred to me. And it was the image of a taxi cab. This yellow metal coffin floating around in the city, like in a sewer, with this young man trapped inside. And it seems like he's surrounded by people, but he's absolutely trapped in that. And, you know, I said to myself, well, that's who I am. I'm that guy. And I knew I needed to write about him because I was getting closer and closer to becoming him. And the only way not to become him was to learn about him and externalize him. So I came up with this idea for Taxi Driver. I knew how to write a script, or I knew what a script looked like because I'd been reading scripts, covering them for Columbia Pictures. So I wrote that script very quickly. I wrote 2 drafts in 10 days. I was crashing on somebody's sofa at the time. And I wrote it strictly for myself as therapy. That's kind of a strange thing to say today when, you know, everybody is so interested in how they can write something that will make them well-known or rich or whatever. And then I didn't hand that script around. I left Los Angeles for about 6 months, and I drifted around the country. Then I came back and got myself together and moved on. But what I learned there was that art was in fact functional. I realized that the need for fiction, I realized that I had been writing nonfiction, and nonfiction was not sufficient to address what was going on. And so I needed to create fiction. I needed to create this character. And I did. I created this character, and he did his job, you know, and I was not him. So that, learning from that, learning how to use oneself as raw material to create the functionality of a script, so that when the time came to teach screenwriting, I knew that I could sort of, you know, teach this method. So then I say to the class, since screenwriting works, and since you are the raw material, and this is not, no one's interested in you writing a script like somebody else. They got other people to do that. The only thing that you have that is uniquely your own is you. And so you say, oh, well, I can write a film just like that. And they say, well, why would we have you do that? We have a film just like that. No, what you have to do is write a film that they don't know they want yet. And therefore, the only thing that you have as raw material is yourself. So then I say to the class, now, you know, thank you all for coming, but this is going to be a workshop class, and I can really only handle 10 students. So I need to pick 10 of you. And I'm not really interested in the 10 best students, 10 best writers. In fact, I don't want to read a word you've written. I'm interested in 10 interesting people. If we're going to spend 10 weeks together, I want to spend it with 10 people that interest me and that I can learn from. So what I need you to do is write on a piece of paper your age, your sex, race, whatever, so I can get a heterogeneous group. And then I want you to write down in no more than 2 sentences your most pressing personal problem at this time. And I will go through your letters, and I will pick 10 people who interest me. And I'll do it probably quite quickly. And if you're not selected, I just throw the pages out and it'll be all forgotten. However, if you are one of the 10 in the class, what you are about to write now will become the public property of the class. This is what we will be studying. We will be studying your problem. And so, you know, that's a bit intimidating. And I usually lose a number of students at that point. But, you know, usually about half of them fill that out. And I take those sheets home and I look at them. and I picked out 10 interesting students. Now, if you do this enough, you start to see the types that fall in. Now, I'm going to be talking about, an American open educational system, so we may run into some trouble here because things I may say may not translate. But there will always be the overweight girl. There will always be the homosexual that's in the closet. There will always be the Jewish kid who hates his mother or father. And you can just sort of predict these types. I haven't been teaching Islamic students, so I don't know what your problems would be, but I'm sure they're equally predictable. And so now I have 10 students. And we come in and have the second class. And now they all have their problem. I'm going to sort of stage this as I go. So that's the first stage. Now, we start to go around the class and said, now we're going to read these problems. And if you have a problem with that, then you shouldn't be here. Because, we are essentially in the dirty laundry business. That's what we do. We expose the frailties of others, but really mostly of ourselves. And the things that we're too embarrassed to tell our friends, we tell the world as we write them down. And so if you don't want to be in the dirty laundry business, then God bless you. But I can't help it. And so now we have these 10 students. And each of them reads the problem that had gotten them into the class. So you're starting to see what I'm up to is much more like group therapy than like screenwriting. And we'll continue this way for a while. So someone reads their problem and then we talk about it and try to refine it a little more. Maybe the problem was a little vague in some ways, and you sort of pressure them and say, what does that exactly mean? How does that manifest itself? So now you're in group therapy, 10 people sort of talking about things that they're embarrassed to talk about, but they have to talk about if they want to take the class. And so immediately you're making them vulnerable, which is a good thing. You're breaking down their defenses right away, even before you even attack their writing. You're breaking them down as people. And after that class, the class of all these kids describing their problems and trying to clarify them, it says, well, you hate your mother. Well, what does that mean, you hate your mother? Exactly how does that manifest itself? Tell me a story about it. Tell me something more. And so after the air is cleared all in that class, we prepare for the next class. And the next class, they are each instructed to bring in 2 metaphors for their problem. Metaphor is something that's very much like the problem, but it isn't the problem. It's not like the problem. It's a standalone expression of the problem. So let me go back to where this all started for me with the taxi cab. The problem in that case was loneliness. A young man's loneliness. Living alone, traveling alone, festering with lonely hate. And I had this metaphor. It came to me, this yellow taxi cab. Now, what does a yellow taxi cab have to do with loneliness? Well, that's sort of the magic thing that art does, because when you make that connection. And I remember when I first looked at the film with Scorsese, and we had more narration about loneliness in the film. And we both looked at each other and said, we should cut a lot of that loneliness narration out. We don't need it. Because every time you see the cab, every time you see that big yellow cab, you feel loneliness. And it's doing its job. It's doing what metaphors do. It's standing in and reaching for the problem. Now, the history of commercial ideas is a history of great metaphors. Jaws is a great metaphor for fear of the unknown. Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, Golem, Frankenstein's Monster, all the great classics have huge metaphorical strength. Dr. Frankenstein makes an artificial person. Now, what an extraordinary metaphor for the mechanical age, the anxiety being caused by the mechanical age. No wonder people just gravitated to that film and films like it, Metropolis, because they were expressing the anxieties of the age. Just like Taxi Driver was expressing the anxieties of that moment. And so you start trying to imagine a metaphor. And so the metaphor is not the thing itself, but it's sort of close to the thing. So if you imagine the problem being here and the metaphor being here, if they touch, there's never going to be a spark. If they're too far apart, there's never going to be a spark. So you have to come just about the right distance. So you feel the spark jumping across. So if the problem is the homosexual boy who is afraid to tell his parents his true nature. Now, if you say, well, I've got a great metaphor there, it's about a guy who's homosexual, but that's not. That's just the same thing. If you really want to learn about the problem, you have to separate it a little bit. So let's say this metaphor. A spy, professional espionage, who wants to quit and doesn't quite know how to come in and out of the cold. And he continues his work, and he's still, well, okay, now we're starting to get somewhere, because that homosexual young man and that spy who wants to be honest and say, I'm not going to do this anymore. Well, there's something connecting there. And when that young homosexual writer starts writing about that spy, he's writing about himself in a way he hasn't learned yet. So he's going to learn something about himself. He's not going to just repeat himself. So when I wrote about the taxi driver, I was writing about somebody else, but I was learning about myself, because he was very close to who I was. And so then the workshop is tasked with coming in with two metaphors. This whole thing, this whole approach is based on a kind of ruthless honesty. And I mean, I don't really know, I'm not familiar enough with life in a theocratic state, although they're trying to create one in the U.S., or much less an Islamic state. And I don't know how much of this investigative method is really useful in your context. So I'm not even going to pretend to understand and just continue to talk about my context. So now, the next week, the class comes back with their metaphors. And then all those metaphors are discussed. And as I said, some of them will be just repetitions of the problem and not very interesting. Some of them will be cliches and not very interesting. But some of them will still have some interest. What happens if the overweight girl is a deaf girl? Oh, that's kind of interesting. Should talk about that for a while. And I remember one class I had a Nisei, Japanese American, and he was trying to write about his Japanese family and the Americanization of that family. And he just wasn't getting anywhere. And I realized that he was just too close to it. And that morning, this was in Los Angeles, there was an article in the paper about the Latino car clubs and gangs. And I said, Desmond, why don't you just go down there? That's what I want you to do. Go down there and look up, find some of these people in the article. Just go to there and ask, I mean, what are they going to do? You're a 19-year-old Japanese American. They're not going to beat you up. They may just tell you to, F off. But I want you to go down there and hang out with those guys. And so he said, yeah, well, he did. Well, they did. And of course, they were fascinated with him. And, he got a big dose of lowrider culture. And he came back and he ended up writing a script about Latino family. And all the things that were blocking him as a Nisei were unblocked by the Latino family. And that's, again, is what a metaphor, can do. One of my more interesting ones, I had a student once who had, as a 17-year-old, had killed a pedestrian. It wasn't his fault. Girl ran out, boom. But, that's something that stays with you. And I'm sure it stayed with him until he died. And he was looking for some way to externalize that pain, that metaphor. And I took him as a student because I thought, well, that's an interesting problem. And then in this class on metaphors, students will bring up metaphors, other students will suggest metaphors. I think for this kid we suggested, I had this idea of a woman who comes to believe that a child she aborted was not in fact aborted, but was born and given away. And that this happened about 12, 13 years ago, and that child is still alive. Now, she has no reason to believe this child is still alive. This idea is starting to consume her. And then on the street one day, she sees that girl. She says, there's my child. She starts following her. Also we're getting into a story. We're also getting into a kind of effective metaphor for this kid who's being haunted by this pedestrian he killed. And that idea of seeing the lost person, which is also one of the great metaphors in Vertigo, the Hitchcock film, and remaking the lost person into the person, that's a really powerful and effective metaphor. And so now all the students have a personal problem that they have agreed upon, and they have a metaphor they're going to try to work. So the next class becomes, what happens when you run the problem into the metaphor? And then you start getting into the oral tradition. Now, I don't think screenwriting is a form of writing. No, it's a form of writing, of course. I don't think it's a form of literature. screenwriting is much closer to the oral tradition than it is to the literary tradition. People don't actually film your words the way they would read your words if you were an author. What the screenwriter does is he tells you a story. Just like you would tell a friend, or when you were, I grew up in a kind of situation where on Sundays the family would get together and they'd swap these stories, you know, and the uncles went hunting and the dog got sick and the bird got away, and that's really what screenwriting is. So you take, you have a problem, loneliness, you have a metaphor, a taxi driver. So what happens now? What can happen? Well, you start just thinking about the possible things that could happen. And eventually, a narrative path will start to evolve. In Taxi Driver, it's a very simple narrative path, which is you have a man festering with rage and anger, and he can't have the girl he wants. He doesn't want the girl he can have. He tries to kill the father figure of one. He fails. He kills the father figure of the other, and by irony becomes a hero. That's the entire story. Now, you get there through the oral tradition. And you know, we could just make this up right here. An American professor is in Tehran, he's speaking. We're going to take a little break. I need to go to the restroom. I got hustled over here so fast I didn't have a chance. So we're going to take 5 minutes. I'll be back as soon as I can. So I said there's this visiting professor speaking in Tehran. In the middle of speech, he has to get up and go to the bathroom. He's kind of embarrassed. He comes back in again. Boom, we're telling a story. And he thinks he sees somebody in the audience, but not sure. And then he is walking down the street later, and he sees this woman again. And he recognizes her. She's the wife of a friend of his. They had, his friend and his wife had separated back in the United States. And he had always sort of liked this woman. He's completely mystified why she's here and she looks like she lives here. She's speaking Farsi. Now, okay, then now we got an interesting situation. Now we got to back up, make it a little more interesting. He's here as a visiting lecturer in some form of archaeological studies, but he also has a secret agenda in which he is going to be a conduit for financing some elements of dissent in the country, which is, of course, a very dangerous adjunct. So now you have this sort of interesting man who is a scholar, you have a hidden agenda, and then you have this woman. And how do they all connect? Well, we start imagining. Now, I'm doing this right now off the top of my head. I haven't thought about this before. That's really how it works. You just think it up. And that's why it's the oral tradition, not the written one, because you are speaking to someone. And so you say to someone, you know, I've got an idea. Can I take you out for a coffee? And let me tell you this story. And you start telling the story. Now, maybe it's not much of a story at the beginning. Maybe it's only 5 or 10 minutes long, but you tell the rudiments of it, just like I did now, and you start to realize what's interesting to people, what's interesting to the listener, what's interesting to you. Think about it some more, tell it again. And you're not really that interested in who you're telling it to. You're not really interested in what they say. What you're interested in is their body language, their reaction. It's like you have to have them. You can't let them go. And maybe if I thought I was losing you, I might have just come up with that bathroom thing, even out of pure cloth, just because I thought it would get your attention. Because I'm trying to keep you. And so that as you tell the story, you can start to see. You read people. You can see what interests them, what doesn't interest them. And if you start to lose them, you have to do something about it. You know, Raymond Chandler once said that if you get in trouble, have someone with a gun walk in the room, because the reader will be so glad that person is there that they won't ask where they came from. And the same thing is sort of true here. So I'm telling you a story, let's say it's about 3 students who are staying home from school to smoke grass, and they're watching movies on TV, on the computer. And they're sort of talking, blah, blah, blah. And then, well, let's say there's 2 of them, and then a third one comes in, and the third one has just stolen something. We'll think of something he could have stolen. And now they're all sort of worried that they might get caught, but what it was he stole some of these electronics, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, now this is, okay, I'm telling this story, maybe it's interesting, but I can see I'm losing you, I'm still losing you. What can I do about that? And I said, okay, a red convertible pulls up. And 2 very large black men, all dressed in purple, get out and walk into the house. Now I've got you back again. I also got these 2 black guys in purple suits to deal with. We'll figure out how to explain them somehow. But the important thing is that I not lose you. And I learned about doing this by just telling the story over and over and over again. And every time you tell it, you go back and outline it again. So you have a little crib sheet with the things, you know, the plot points. And maybe there's only 10 or 12 of them. And you tell a story and you redo it, and now you're up to about 15 things. You decide to add a few things that are sort of interesting. Got to add that thing about the 2 guys in the purple suits. So you're moving on bit by bit to the next step, which is the outline. And outline is exactly what it says. You know, there's usually between 40 and 50 things happen in a feature-length film. We're not talking about shots, we're talking about sort of scenes. So, you know, you have the first scene, the lecture, and then you have a scene, an expositional scene explaining why he's in Tehran, and then you have the scene where he first sees this girl, then you have, okay, boom, 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 boom. Starting in each scene, press number. Scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4, scene 5. And so that every time you tell it, it gets more interesting, you add another scene. And now you're starting to add little notes to yourself, like bits of dialogue. This is where he says to her, you know, you remember that time we went to New Orleans. Okay, right, New Orleans in there. Okay, I gotta bring that up. So now you're checking your notes. You're going through it, and eventually you will come up with a fairly detailed outline. This is how I work, not how I expect you to work. I'm just telling you how I work. And I don't write anything until I know what I'm going to do. Until I know what, basically what happens on page 55. So that if you, in fact, if you go on the web and, you know, just Google Schrader outlines, you'll see some of these outlines for Taxi Driver, Jimbo, Mosquito Coast, Raging Bull. I still do the very same thing today, the outlines for First Reformed. And what I do in these outlines is I start to do projected page codes. So I'm telling you a scene and about two kids and smoking the grass, and the buddy comes in with a stolen electronics and says, okay, how many pages is that? That feels like not 2 3/4 pages, maybe 3 pages. Okay, I'll put that down at 3 pages. And then you tell, now you're not only getting a sense of the things that are happening, you're getting a sense of the pace at which they're happening. Because movies and filmed art exist in a fixed timeline. It's not like a book, you can set it down and pick it up again. It's not like a painting, you can come back and pick up where you left off. And so a scene that is good on page 30, the same scene might not be good on page 36. It's the same scene, it's just 6 pages too late. And so now that's also what you're trying to calibrate. That's what the outline is starting to do. It's not only telling you all the things that happen and the order in which they happen, it's also giving you the rhythm of how they happen. And so that, and it's also starting to give you a sense of, when I first started doing this, I was just starting out, I even did an outline once where I put different types of scenes in different colors. I put comic relief in one color, action in another color, exposition in another color, romance in another color, so I could just look at the outline and see the color patterns. And all of a sudden, gee, there's a big gob of red there, so we better stick some green in the middle of that red. You know, maybe it didn't need a little bit of action in there, it's getting too expositional in there. And so then, as you do this, and then now the students in the class are starting to, you know, tell their stories in the class. And of course it's a pretty judgmental class. But as you do this and you do it enough, one of two things is going to happen, and they're both good things. One is going to be that the idea dies on you. You just get sick of it. And you can feel it in your stomach that this isn't really that interesting to me anymore. Well, that's a good thing, because there's nothing more debilitating than writing scripts that people don't want to make. And you do that 4 or 5 times, and you're kind of burnt. And you kind of cut yourself off at the ankles. So when a script doesn't want to be written, the best thing you can do for yourself is not write it, unless you want to do it as an exercise in learning or to fill a class obligation. But to write something that you don't believe in, that other people want to see, not only is it very hard to do, it's exhausting, but it also breaks your heart. The other thing that can happen when you tell a story enough is all of a sudden the story will say to you, okay, that's enough with the oral tradition. That's enough with the yak, yak, yak. Let's get to work. I want to be written now. And then you start to write. And at that point, the writing comes quite quickly, because you more or less know what happens on page 75. You know what happens on page 35. You know the arcs of the rhythm. You've been telling this story so many times. You know a lot of the dialogue already. And you'll also have a guide, so that as you're typing this out, and you have a scene that you thought would be 3 pages, it's really, after 2 you realize that the scene's dead. So okay, that's 2, not 3. Another scene maybe a little longer. Well, if you get to page, say page 45, and you're on page, and you're typing and you're on page 52, that means you're 7 pages ahead of where you thought you'd be. Did you make a mistake in the outline? Or did you make a mistake in the writing? Is this script really 7 pages longer than it should be? At which point maybe you should take that into consideration right now. Or is the outline wrong? And should I go back and change the numbers on the outline so that I can sync it up again? And it can be either one. But you do always have a sense of where am I in the story? Because if you're writing page, for me, probably not for you, if you're writing page 80, and you feel like you should be on page 60, you're not going to be able to write page 80 very well, because you know you're too late to the dance. And better to recalibrate so that you're writing a scene on page 60 and it's the right scene. And when it's the right scene, you know it's the right scene. It goes very fast. When young writers come to me and they say, here's something I don't know if it's very good. I did it in a couple of weeks. Boy, I love to hear that. I mean, I thought, yeah, I'll read that script. When they come to me and they say, I've been working on this for 2.5 years now, and I've written 6 drafts, and you know, my heart breaks. I said, but please, whatever you do, don't make me read it. You know, if you haven't, if you've been working on 2.5 years and 6 drafts, you've not only wasted a lot of your time, you're threatening to waste some of mine. And it's the same thing too. When something is good, it usually comes quite quickly. Now, it may have taken a jazz musician 10 years to get to the point one morning where he where he comes up and does his best piece of work. You know, how long did it take for him to do, you know, that Miles Davis, Miles Ahead piece? Did it take 2 hours or did it take 10 years? Well, both, because it took him 10 years to get to the place where he could do it in 2 hours. And the same thing is true of screenwriting. When you get to the place, it should move quite quickly. This last film I did, First Reformed, I had, it's a spiritual film, and I had written about spiritual films, but I swore I would never make one. And then I was speaking with Pavel Pawlowski and giving him an award for Ida, the film about the Polish nun. And we were talking about my book and spirituality in cinema. And I left that, I walked away and I said, it's time now. It's time to write that spiritual film. All my life, I have been saying I will never write this script. I will never write it. Don't expect me to write this script. And all of a sudden it's time now. And as soon as I made that intellectual commitment, all of a sudden the ideas started coming. And then, you know, 2 months later, I had a script. Now, did it take me 2 months to write that script, or did it take me 50 years to write that script? You know, so that, but if something doesn't want to happen, that's a good warning sign. And you know, forcing it to happen is not going to help you. So you have, well, actually, I left a step out. Well, it's simply the things that happen while you're telling the story. And they can be regimented and manipulated. They can, you know, there was a guy named Robert McKee about 20 years ago who wrote a book on screenwriting that became a very big cult in the US. It's one of the worst things that happened to screenwriters because he had this whole scheme of 3 acts and what should happen at every given point. And I'm sure people are still trying to teach that. Well, that's not how storytelling goes. Now, yes, it does fall into 3 acts quite often, because that's how we think, past, present, future. But sometimes the story is 2 acts, sometimes it's 5 acts. And then sometimes you don't care how many acts it is. Maybe it's 1 act. And you learn, every good artist has to teach himself. And, you know, you can take these classes, but, you know, take what you want from them. And the same thing is true about watching movies. You know, take what you want. There used to be a kind of theory of storytelling. Hitchcock was a big advocate of this, which was parallel storylines. You know, meanwhile, at the back of the ranch, this is happening here, cut, this is happening there, here to there, here to there. And that was thought to be good screenwriting. And then somebody came along and had only one story and only one character. And I saw this film, and it was filmed by Bressot called Pickpocket. And then I wrote a version of that myself. And I wrote a film where you only see the world through one character. There is no second story. You hear his voice, you see what he sees. There is no other story at all. And so if you have a teacher who's telling you, well, you have your A story and your B story and your C story, well, yes, sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just have your A story, you know. And so be very careful of, you know, taking things that people say, including me, you know, at face value. So this is, I'm trying to make this as brief as possible. And we've now done 5 weeks on this class, and I now give the students permission to write. Well, clearly, most of them aren't going to make the deadline by the end of the semester. You know, the scripts will be coming in over the next year. But for me, it was more important that I walk them through this process than I start having them write on week 1 or 2. So, you know, 5 weeks of talking. Week 6, you can start to write. And so then you have several more weeks of class. Usually I do some exercises at this point. I'll do an exposition exercise. I'll do a dialogue exercise. I give them an assignment, you know, usually an undoable assignment. Like giving them a whole list of exposition needs and saying, you've got 4 pages. Well, it's impossible. How they learn it's impossible is, you know, very instructive. And usually then I end the class with, I bring in another screenwriter, Hollywood screenwriter, who thinks the opposite of what I do. And just to remind my students that I'm not necessarily right. And take from me what you can, but don't take it as gospel. And when I lived in Los Angeles, I always wrote at night, influence of caffeine, nicotine, alcohol. And I wrote these kind of dramas. I started maybe 10 o'clock at night, right till 4 or 5 in the morning. And I had another friend who wrote comedy, and he would get up at 5 or 6 a.m., smoke a joint, and write till 10. And he didn't know what he was going to write. He'd just get high and start writing. It was the opposite of me. And so I bring like someone like that into the class who has a totally different approach, and just to help the audience. I mean, not the audience, the class, to start to try to find their own way through this. And I've taught this class, I don't know, maybe a half dozen times. And usually there's always one script that sort of makes it through. And one student that sells a script. So it certainly doesn't work for all of them. But in this business, 1 out of 10 is a great batting average. So that's sort of my kind of approach to screenwriting. Okay, so I guess it's just a matter of Q&A.
میتونیم سوال و جواب داشته باشیم.
خوشحالم که در خدمت شما هستم. یه سوالی داشتم و این که ما چطوری میتونیم طرحهامون، فیلمنامه‌هامون رو به کمپانی امریکایی برسونیم و صرفاً یه ایمیل دریافت نکنیم و بتونیم یه چالنجی صحبتی داشته باشیم و احتمالاً میتونیم با متنمون درخواست کنیم که خودمونم اونجا حضور داشته باشیم یا حالا حداقل تو اون پروژه وجود داشته باشیم یا
Film schools aren't very useful normally. You don't learn much at a film school, but you do learn one thing. You learn how to network. And networking is what it's all about. So one of the best film schools were the ones in New York and Los Angeles where you can network better. And so the idea of writing a script and mailing it off, it becomes a very long shot idea because in the end it's the people you know, the people, when you're, like I said over here, when you're telling your story, if you're smart, you're telling it to people who are also hustling their way too. And so it's theoretically possible to write a terrific script and get it through all the restrictions, but it's very unlikely. But now times are also changing. We used to live in an age when there were great barriers to filmmaking. We kept a lot of people out of the business. Women and blacks and gay people. Hollywood was a club. Well, that period is now gone. It's gone because of technology. We live in now a totally democratized international film business. So that the good news is that anybody can make a film, anybody. The bad news is nobody can make a living at it. And so you can make a film. All you need is your phone. You can shoot it on there, you can edit it on there, mix it, and distribute it off your phone. But the complication is that you and about 58,000 other people are doing that. And how do you get to be, one of the 50,000? The one, how do you get to be Ali Abbasi? And it's a combination of talent and calculation and luck. You have to be ready to be at the right place at the right time and how to seize that moment. What has happened now in the last 4 or 5 years that I'm seeing more and more of is a young writer has an idea for a movie. Now, he doesn't have the money or the expertise to make that a feature film. And nobody wants to sit there and watch a 2-hour failed film. They'll walk out of the room after 10 minutes. But now we're seeing a birth of these, what I call audition films, short films. So you have a feature-length script that you want to make, and you can't get anybody to read it, you can't get anybody interested in it, but there's a couple great scenes in it. And you make a short film of this. There was one a couple of years ago about this cop. The first scene was so spectacular. It's at a funeral, and he starts giving an elegy for his wife, and then he breaks down and he starts playing a Bruce Springsteen song. Forget the name of it. but it was just a dynamite scene. And what the student did was, rather than sell that script, he filmed that scene, and he got an actor and a church and some extras. And so instead of sending a script, which has to go through so many layers of approval, and most of the people who read scripts are there to say no. So he made this film and entered this film into short film competitions. And some people saw it, and then more people saw it. And he ended up getting the film financed based on his audition film, rather than based on a script. So that's another approach that I'm seeing more and more of, because there are now a lot of short film competitions around the world. And more, these short film competitions are just audition film competitions. They're all, young people who are trying to get another film made, and they're going to show you a scene or two of it to try to convince you they know how to do it. Because not only are they convincing you of their skills as a writer, but also their skills as a director. I mean, other than that, it's a very unanswerable question. I mean, how do you get your? I don't know. If I were starting out now, could I succeed? I'm not sure. I was lucky. I walked into a certain time frame in the history of cinema, and I got lucky. And I guess everybody who succeeds gets lucky.
میخواستم راجع به تفاوت فیلمنامه کلاسیک، مدرن و پست مدرن صحبت کنید و راجع به ویژگی هاشون بیشتر بشنویم، خصوصا فیلمنامه های مدرن و پست مدرن که حداقل توی ایران کمتر تدریس میشه یا کمتر راجبش صحبت میشه.
Well, I think what you mean by postmodern is, the meta film, the film that knows it's a film. The first person to do this was Godard. Breathless knew very well that it was a movie. And you knew it was a movie, and you knew that the director and the actors knew it was a movie. Now that breaks down an old tradition of narrative, is where you're not supposed to, the audience isn't supposed to see how it's made. Godard says, here, I'll show you exactly how it's made. And if I have two characters and I'm bored with them, I'll pan and shoot another direction. And then Tarantino took that another step and took it into the ironic mode, where the actors know they're acting. I don't know if anyone is preferable. I tend to work in the sort of realistic way. On the other hand, some of these kind of structuralist films are a lot of fun when they're pulled off. So I don't think there is a chronological evolution. I mean, there is in terms of experimentation, but they all work all the time. It's just like you're saying, we now have EDM. Does that mean blues aren't good anymore? Does that mean rock and roll is not good anymore? Does that mean that jazz is not good anymore? They're all good at the same time. They just have different degrees of popularity at any given time. But I keep going back to what you said before about this. There is no American. The studio system is dead. They're dying. What is there anymore? There used to be 6 or 7 studios. Now 20th Century is gone. Paramount is up for sale. There is no American film industry anymore. Netflix is opening up a production studio in Spain. That's where it's happening. That's the whole world. This idea of breaking into the American market isn't even, we're only 40% of the world's market. We used to be more. So I think a lot of people still harbor this idea that going Hollywood is the measure of success, and I just don't see that. I mean, what I see as the measure of success is the person I had dinner with last night, the kid from Tehran who's making a film in Denmark, and ends up at the Academy Awards. You know, that's how you get to the Academy Awards.
Hello. I want you to, because of your spectacular characteristics in your scripts, I want you respectfully to please describe the levels, the process of making and creating a character, internally, externally, and how you go through the action versus traits of the character.
Character is contradiction. I mean, that's the heart and soul of character. It's a man, a woman who says one thing, does another. That's when they start to get interesting. You know, I loved her so much I hate her. That's character. So when you have a character, you have to start to split them apart, and they start to do things that don't necessarily line up with the things they think they're doing or the things they believe they're doing. Now you've got some tension in there, you know. And I remember I've often said to an actor, you know, I said that, you know, I know at this point this character opens his mouth and he says these words. I know he says it, I'm absolutely sure. I don't know why he says it. I haven't figured that out yet. And that level of mystery is what makes characters interesting. Now the actor will hear that speech and he'll address it in a certain way, or she'll address it. But a character has to move around. When characters do what they're supposed to do, they're not very interesting. And you know, you can, there's a lot of little gimmicks that people use, you know, a character is sort of dying and you're not, well, we'll do a sex change operation. If it's a woman, make it a man, vice versa. Start thinking about it that way. Well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea, but by thinking about it that way, you've now freed yourself from some of the boundaries you've set. Now these are boundaries of, sometimes they're boundaries of logic, sometimes they're boundaries of propriety, sometimes they're boundaries of what you think the audience wants to see. The audience doesn't know what it wants to see. But you think, oh, they wouldn't want her to do that. You know, they would turn on her if she did it. Well, are you so sure? You know, and you know, the most powerful censor is yourself. And when you start censoring yourself, that's when the trouble begins. You know, fortunately here we have a whole government that will do it for you.
Hello, yeah. You know, there's a lot of interesting and innovative things happening in the documentary film field. So I was wondering if you have any advice or comment on writing a feature documentary film.
Well, yeah, documentaries have exploded because of technology. You know, you used to be able to have to choose what you shot. Now people just shoot endlessly, and it doesn't cost a dime. You know, all it costs is, you know, whatever it takes for that cameraman to follow your subject around. And so in the past, documentary filmmakers would sort of settle in on one subject and make them. But a new trend has evolved because of digital technology, which is these documentary teams, which are making maybe 20, 30 films at a time. Alex Gibney is a very famous documentary filmmaker, published a picture a year ago, and he said, this is what Alex Gibney looks like. And there were 50 people in the photo. They were just doing that many projects. Now that doesn't mean, because they're making 20 films, they're gonna make 20 films. No, they're making 20 films so that they can make 2. And they don't know which ones are gonna pop. Now in the past, you would have to know. But now you can just follow somebody around. You can follow 10 people around and figure one of them is gonna do something interesting. And then I'm gonna have a movie. And the others will forget about it. So that's a whole new approach to documentary, which is, just letting the story tell itself, rather than trying to, be economically responsible by telling the story, So it has created a very exciting new market for documentary. Documentaries are all over the internet. Of course, the price is going down. My friend Joe Berlinger, who did the Paradise Lost documentaries, he used to do one at a time. Now he's doing 10 of them. And he said to me that he used to be able to get $100,000 out of England for a documentary. So now he said, now you get 10. So that's the way the economics change. But there are many more people watching these documentaries than used to. So even though the individual markets are dropping, Netflix, which operates on this notion of the churn, constantly churning, new product. Not really so much a theory of hits and failures, but just a constant overturning of product and figuring that will keep the subscription base alive. And so it is, we're looking at entirely new models of filmmaking, film financing, economic distribution. We really hardly know what a movie is anymore. We used to think it was about 2 hours long and you saw it in a dark room. Well, sometimes now it's 10 minutes long and sometimes it's 100 hours long. Mad Men is a film. And sometimes you don't watch it in a dark room. In fact, very rarely do you watch it in a dark room. And sometimes you don't watch it on a big screen. So, one of the tricks of film financing right now is if I create a model whereby I financed a film, that model will probably be obsolete in a year or two. That's how quickly it's all changing. And every 3-4 months we are getting new exhibition models, new ways to monetize, So it is a very, very fluid situation. I used to think that it was a period of transition, but I now believe that we have entered a period of permanent transition. There will never be an equilibrium.
من سلام عرض میکنم خدمت شما. یه سوالی داشتم این بود که اگه اشتباه نکنم یه جایی فرموده بودید که کاراکتر روند تاکسی، کاراکتر تراویس بیکر از یکی از کاراکترهای برسون برداشت شده، یعنی اون کاراکتر ازش استفاده شده که این ساخته بشه. میخواستم چیزی که بدونم اینه که چجوری میتونیم از یه کاراکتری که توی دنیای سینما برای ما خیلی نزدیکه، خیلی ما از یه فیلم و یه کاراکتر تاثیر گرفتیم، چجوری میتونیم اونو اقتباس کنیم و به یه کاراکتر محبوب خودمون تبدیل کنیم، بیاریم توی فیلمنامه خودمون و بکنیم کاراکتری که داریم روش کار میکنیم. آیا ما اول این کاراکتری که میخوایم رو مینویسیم بعد سعی میکنیم از کاراکتری که دوست داریم استفاده کنیم، یا نه اون کاراکتری که دوست داریم انقدر روی ما تاثیر میذاره که خودش میشه شروع کاراکتر بعدی؟ مرسی.
It's either a confused question or a confused translation. I'm trying to find, the moment you say, I'm going to make a likable character, what does that mean?
I can say it a little easier for you. Is that he says that when we are influenced by a character in a famous movie, like we love a Bresson movie and a character in Bresson movie, how can we change it and how can we use it in a way that we are writing a script in our own script?
Okay, well, first of all, there are no new characters. So everything, you don't have to worry about plagiarizing because that's what we all do. We don't create anything new. Every character we create, every story we tell is a composite version of stuff we've read and seen in the past. And let me give you, say, an example. I decided to write this script First Reformed. And it was based on I went through and looked at films of the past of this type that I had liked. And I took the main character from Bresson, from Diary of a Country Priest. I took the setting from Winterlight by Bergman. I took the ending from Ordette by Carl Dreyer. I took a levitation scene from Tarkovsky, Sacrifice. And then I tied it all up with the confused logic of Taxi Driver. And what happened? Here we had a movie whose models were all 50 years old, except Taxi was 40 years old. But these are films that are 50, 60 years old. And yet, my film comes out, and people say it feels so today. So you don't have any anxiety about, ripping off the past. There is no, new wine. It's just new bottles. And so I wouldn't, have a problem doing that. Really what often sparks creation is when you take two things and lay them on top of each other. Two things that necessarily wouldn't lay on top of each other and do it. And that would always be a good rule of thumb if you have a character that you want to rip off and not get caught. The thing is not, you can steal. It's perfectly all right to steal. You just can't get caught. And so if you steal from the same 7-Eleven, the same soda shop, week after week, they're going to catch you because they know that. So you steal from the gas station, you steal from the flower shop, you steal from the computer store, and now they don't know where you're stealing from. And so that's how you get away with it.
Hello. What's your biggest mistake in your whole life?
My biggest mistake? I think, I think, like all people, there's that, one person you said, well, damn, I fucked that one up. But, not much you can do about that. And the truth is, we all have a fantasy that we can start over. Wouldn't it be great if I were 25 again? And then I think, wait a second. If I were 25 again, maybe I wouldn't be so lucky. I got lucky. And maybe I could go start all over again at 25 and just not get lucky and have, not get any of the things done I wanted to get done. But I'll let you, whatever your biggest mistake is, that's mine.
Well, thank you for your inspiring approach to externalize problems. I used it myself, and I asked myself if you met the problem that you were feared of using all your interesting problems to turn it into stories. Do you take your same problem and just make different metaphors out of the same problem, or you wait looking forward to get the next good problem in life so you have inspiration for more good films, good movies?
Well, the problems are fairly predictable as you go through life. The problems you have as a teenager and as a young married person started out, a middle-aged person, they're not going to differ that much. But they will be unique to you, and what you need to do is find the metaphor. I'll give you another example. Some years ago, I decided it was time to write a midlife movie. Now that's a problem that everybody has, everybody in this room will have. At a certain point you realize you're 40 years old and you're starting to hit the backstretch. The backstretch. like it on a race course. Anyway, but I'm talking about, you know, midlife crisis, when you feel your life is starting to be past its peak. And I said, you know, it's time to write a midlife movie. Now, what is my midlife metaphor? And I still kept thinking about it, and about a guy who quits his job or becomes a soldier of fortune or takes off with a co-ed, you know, and bums his way around the country. Just one cliche after another. You know, these aren't good metaphors, these are cliches. And I couldn't find the metaphor. And at some point I said, I guess maybe I'm not going to find a good one. We'll have to let this midlife crisis thing pass by and look for something else. And then I had a dream. I woke up about 5 in the morning, and there was a guy who came to me in the dream. He was a drug delivery boy, cocaine. And he came right there, boom, right in front of my face. His name was John. And I hadn't seen him in a year. But it was very vivid. And I woke up and I said, wow, that was vivid. You know, why did he come to me so vividly? And I said, what were we talking about? He said, well, he was asking me about the movies. He wanted to know what movies he should see. I said, that's it, isn't it? I couldn't find him, so he found me. That's my metaphor. A 40-year-old drug delivery boy whose boss is quitting to start a cosmetics company, and he has no skills. Then the movie was Light Sleeper. Willem Dafoe played the boy, and Susan Sarandon played his boss, and I had my midlife metaphor. And as soon as I couldn't go back to sleep, of course. By 6 o'clock, I was in my office making notes. By that evening, I had tracked down the original people, and I was hanging out with them, you know. And so when it strikes, it strikes. And but sometimes it won't, and sometimes you just have to say, I'm going to walk away. I can't find that metaphor I'm looking for.
My question is, we found a great problem. We found a great metaphor, and we know end of the story. How can we continue this problem, this metaphor, and is still interesting? You have a method for it. You have something.
Well, do you know what the first scene is?
What?
Do you know what the first scene is?
Yeah.
Well, that's where you start. You know what the second scene is?
No.
Well, then you know, I can do it for you right now. If you told me the first scene, I could sit and say, okay, here's the second scene, and you could say, no, I don't think that's very good. And then all of a sudden you would have a second scene. You know, just throw yourself into it, and that's the only way you can do it. It's just it's a kind of play. It's a kind of creative play, and you know, I can't believe you have a first scene and you don't have a second scene. It's impossible. You know? There's gonna, of course, if the first scene has anything in it of value, it's gonna bridge off to a second scene. You know? Or unless you want to do parallel narratives, and then you can start have two first scenes. You know?
Thank you. That's my answer.
I'd like to ask you about script structure for short movies. I'm here. How does it work? And the same as a feature film, or can we change or miss some parts? And I also ask about the difference between short movies and feature films.
I'm not a big fan of short films. I think there's something that starts to happen after about an hour and 15 minutes. If you can hold a person that long, you can start to play with them. If you can keep them in the theater, interested, an hour and 15 minutes, then you can start. I'll come back to the other thing, but so you take, let's say, the model of Taxi Driver, First Reformed, American Gigolo, light sleeper. You take a guy, in my case it's usually a guy, and you get under his skin. You hear his voice. He's now telling you about his life. Sometimes the things are interesting, sometimes not so interesting. Sometimes I went to the store and the store was closed. Sometimes my mother died yesterday. They're all the same voice. And then, and you start to see the world through him. And he gets under your skin. And you start identifying with him because you can't help it. If you watch him for an hour, you're going to identify. There's no other choice. Now, if I've gotten you in this theater for 45, 50 minutes, you're identified. And now what I do is I just start splitting him off, little by little, little by little. And he starts doing things that you wouldn't approve of. Now I've got the viewer in a very interesting place. They've made an identification, and now their character is violating the identification. But not so much, it's only little by little. And they have to decide, I have now identified with a person I don't think worthy of my identification. What should I do about that? Maybe I'll watch it a little more, see what happens. And you're starting now to split the viewer's head. And the moment that happens, good things happen. I can't tell you exactly what they will be, but the moment you put a viewer in a place where they're uncomfortable, they're going to solve that problem somehow. And their solution will be probably be a very good one. So for that reason, I prefer, the longer length. Of course, now we have a whole new genre of the long form, and which operates in another way, much more in the old Dickensian way, rather. And then that's a whole other form of identification, and it had multiple plots, multiple characters, and that's where a lot of the best storytelling is going on right now in the long form. But for me, to make a short film would be simply as a audition to make a longer version of it. The film I was trying to think of, I just thought of the title. It's called Promise Road, and that's the one that starts with the guy at the funeral who goes crazy. What? Thunder Road, is that what it is? Yeah. And he starts playing Thunder Road, yeah. Well, that opening scene was a short.
Hi, firstly, it's a great pleasure to meet you in real life, and secondly, my question is about Robert Bresson. He says that in his book, Notes on Cinematograph, thinking, maybe this could be bad translation, but I remember like this. Thinking is one of the biggest enemy while you are working on your script.
With thinking?
Thinking is one of your biggest enemy.
Yeah, thinking.
One of your biggest enemy while you are working on your script. So what do you think about it? How can we understand that?
I think it's true. And particularly if you began like I did as a critic, you have to watch out for that. Because what you do as a critic is often very logic and structure. And what you're doing as an artist sometimes doesn't make a lot of sense. And sometimes you don't want to know what sense it makes. And you have to allow for that. In the past, I've drawn this distinction between a critic and a filmmaker. And a critic is sort of like a medical examiner. They want to get that body, that corpse, up on the table. They want to cut it open. They want to figure out how and why it lived. The filmmaker is like a pregnant woman. He, she has something that wants to be born. And all they care about is not harming that. And just so the baby is born alive. So if you let the medical examiner into the birthing room, he will kill that baby. And that's the danger of thinking, and that's what Bresson is talking about. He's talking about letting the critic into the birthing room.
Hello, sir. I think it's once in a lifetime opportunity for aspiring filmmakers like us to be able to attend your class. My question is, you said that the idea of Taxi Driver came to you and you started writing the script because you were afraid that you would become like that man. I have seen a lot of filmmakers making films about their loss and fear and things that they don't understand because they think in the process of making that film they will discover the answers. I just want to know what happened to you after you finished writing the script. Did you get a closure or something of that sort?
Well, no, yeah, I mean, the script worked. It got me over that place. But then, of course, other things had to happen. I drifted around the country for 6 months, staying on college friends' houses and that, just to get my own mental health back. And then I returned to Los Angeles. So it wasn't enough to write the script. I didn't get better as soon as I said the end. No, the end allowed me to go to a place where I could get better, you know. And the script separated me from the pathology that was driving me and allowed me to find a more balanced way to live. And then in life, and then in a curious way, a few years later, it ended up actually getting made.
سلام، خسته نباشید. من میخواستم بدونم که پایان فیلمنامه برای شما چقدر مهمه؟ آیا اگر پایان فیلمنامه رو ندونید شروع میکنید به نوشتنش؟ مرسی.
I wouldn't write a script if I didn't know the last scene. I wouldn't write a script if I didn't know the title, and I didn't know the last scene. If I don't know the title, I just can't go. I can't go there. I just, you know. And in the last scene, now I have known to change the last scene, but I only changed it after I wrote it. The first reformer changes the last scene completely, but I couldn't have written it if I didn't know it. You know, the first version. The first version was the ending of Diary of a Country Priest, and then I rewrote it and made it the ending of Her Death, with liberties, of course.
I have this question that whenever I started writing, and after that I came to this idea whether this is good for, for cinema. I mean that I write something, but it's good. It's more better to write it. It's better to write to expose it in literature, not in cinema. I know how you manage to write for a film to be watched, not to be read.
Well, that's a very big question. And literature is about words. Cinema is really about images. And you can be very literate in a literary way and very ignorant in a visual way. I came from a background that kind of prohibited imagery, so all the churches I grew up in were just like 4 white walls. And I was taught that if you had something to say, you said it with words or singing, but you didn't say it in pictures. And so I had to learn that in my 20s, because, you know, this is an idea. And this idea is not plastic water bottle. Plastic water bottle is 3 words. This is not 3 words. This is an idea. And then if I move this way, it's another idea. And then if I swing it around, it's another idea. And so if you can think of a drama with the logic of images, then you belong to be making it as a film. But if you want to use the logic of literature, which conjures up the reader's concept. So when you say in literature, a plastic bottle of literature, a plastic bottle of water about to fall across the edge, now that the reader's going to read that and conjure up an image. And you're not going to, but if you make a film, you're going to be making the image. So, you know, I came from a generation that fell in love with movies in the 60s, so it always seemed like the thing to do. The generation before me wanted to write the great American novel, so it's also a kind of generational thing.
خسته نباشید. سوال من در رابطه با اینه که یک نویسنده معمولا توی هر مرحله که پیش میره انتخاب‌های زیادی رو پیش روش داره. این انتخاب‌ها رو شما چجوری فیلتر میکنید که بعضا ممکنه که چند تا از اونها انتخاب‌های خیلی خیلی خوبی باشن؟ متشکرم.
That's why the oral tradition works. You know, you just tell it. Sometimes you won't even finish telling it, you know it was wrong. You just feel it's wrong in your stomach. And sometimes you'll see it in their eyes, that's the right one, you know. And that's why I think, particularly at this stage of your career, you have to just put yourself on the line and tell stories and see how they work. Because you sit there and you write them over and over, and you lose track of how people are going to respond to this. You know, just me sitting here, looking at all your various expressions. You know, I'm clocking all of this. Now, I don't need to sell you anything, but if I felt I was losing you, I would do something, or I would just say, okay, thank you.
سلام. آیا موقع نوشتن فیلمنامه‌تون به لایه‌های زیرین یا زیر متن فیلمنامه فکر می‌کنید یا خیر؟
Hello, while you are writing your script, do you give it a thoughts about deep layers of your script, and do you give it a thought about the subtext and podtext of your script?
Oh yes, and but often you're layering them in to some degree unconsciously. I mean, on this last script I wrote, after I wrote the first script, I reread it, I was thinking, I said, boy, there's something going on here that I wasn't quite aware of. And if I just change the shadings on a couple of these scenes, that something will start to come to the top. And I didn't quite realize it was there, but now I realize it's there. And you know, maybe the sub-theme is the one about the seduction of martyrdom, which is in that film. But it was sort of at this level. And I read it, I said, no, just we'll raise it ever so slightly and get the seduction of martyrdom up 1-2 more notches. Then it'll be a genuine sub-theme. Well, I think it's my bedtime.